The opportunity that we have here at the Impact Investing Institute acts as a bridge between the mainstream of financial markets and new economic ideas. As an organisation, we connect the world's largest asset allocators and asset owners with government actors, with foundations, with civic society actors, and really explore this space of what does it take to transform capital markets in support of an economy that's fairer, that's greener, and that's more resilient. Impact investing is a powerful tool for driving that transformation because impact investing focuses on the intentionality and measurability in the management of it. So there's something real that is happening in that transformation, but also it works within the logic of capital markets. In the UK, our great economic challenge we have as a country is that we have 2.8 million people who are too unwell to work. The largest single factor behind that fact is ill health caused by diet. This is a huge economic challenge. So quite apart from it being a health challenge, this is an economic challenge. This is a productivity challenge. Actually, it's in everybody's interest, in every investor's interest, in every business's interest to have a healthy society. That's just good for business. It's good for investing.
Kieron, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi, Scott.
I'm in a bit of a muddle because I don't know where to start. Because I've concluded either your father was in MI6 or you were in the Protected Persons Service, because I found almost nothing about your early years. You don't need to reveal state secrets.
Yeah.
But if it was the former, just blink really fast. There was a ladder pull on your ear. So maybe you could just tell me, where did you grow up?
Well, actually, I mean, there is a story with it. Sadly, it's nothing as exciting as a John le Carré novel. But actually, this is a slightly sore point in my family, which is there aren't many photos of me when I was young either. In fact, almost no photos of me when I was young. I have an older brother who there are plenty of photos.
So you have siblings?
Yeah, I have siblings. And so what I presume has happened is that in various house moves, and we had quite a lot of house moves when I was younger, my lovely parents probably lost the photo album with photos of me as a kid. But because they're so lovely, a few years ago, I was in the attic at my parents' place helping my dad sort through some stuff. He said, "Oh, what's this?" And I went over and said, "Oh, look what I've just found." And it was a photo album of me as a child. But what I realized as I looked through all the photos were that they were photos of me plus other family members. And so what my lovely parents must have done is gone through every other photo album and without telling me, found every photo of me that it was in, I don't know, my grand's photo album or my aunt's photo album, my brother's photo, and put it into one. But then in a very British way, didn't fess up to doing that and just as if they had stumbled upon it, which I think is shows what caring parents they are. But yes, I grew up in the UK. I grew up in Cornwall, which has been voted by the universe as the most beautiful place in the universe. And it's a wonderful bit of the UK. And I grew up on Air Force bases. My dad was an Air Force pilot. I had the sort of childhood you might expect growing up in a place like Cornwall as well, which was really blessed. It's a beautiful bit of the world. It's very outdoorsy. I'm a wonderful surfer. Again, I'm grateful that you can't fact check this on Google. Let me just put out to the universe that I'm a wonderful surfer. And it was a lovely childhood. It was an interesting childhood. So my parents, my mother's Indian, my father's British, and I live in a city now where that is just the normal. But 40 odd years ago, that was not the normal. And so it was a kind of an interesting childhood in that way as well, to grow up in a beautiful, beautiful place. But I think quite a lot of the things that got me, I've now come to realize have had me focused on questions of social outcomes and impact. I think come from that quite early stage of seeing how society deals with things that are different.
Was your mother raised in India or in the UK?
Neither. Kenya. And so she moved across to the UK in her late teens.
And was your father a career Air Force man?
He was, and comes from a long line of the family being involved in the military. So my brother and I are actually the first generation of our family not to be involved in the military as far back as we can can remember. So I'm not sure that's we didn't choose the military. I think it's more the military wouldn't have chosen us.
And did you have childhood experiences going to Kenya or India or was there an extended family there?
Not really, to tell the truth. And not uncommon for our community, most of the extended family moved across to the UK and lived in particular cities within the UK. I remember having a sort of kind of very mixed experience of I would have life in Cornwall with the network that existed there. Then we would go see my mother's family in different bits of the UK. And as is often the case, first generation immigrants and second generation immigrants move next to each other. And so you would go to places where you would experience a very different language, very different food, all within the UK. And then you go back to home and I guess a little bit of a time there was a sort of sense of which of these is mine, which of these do you belong to? A little bit of that, but to tell the truth, I mean, the main experience was the exact opposite of this wonderful diversity of experiences and perspectives and tastes and sounds and colours. And as I say, it's a world that I live in London now, and my kid goes to a school where pretty much it's just like our commons, just our local state school. It's much more common that the kids have that family background of mixed ethnicity than the opposite. And so that's quite interesting also, just to kind of, in your lifetime, just see something that has moved quite fundamentally in terms of how society is.
But was there any other implications to growing up in a mixed race family for you in Cornwall when that was an oddity, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I mean, kind of tell the line that there was only one other kid who looked like me, who I knew, who was my brother. But I think it could be overstated. It was an experience of, as I say, experiencing different worldviews, different cultures, one of acceptance. What I did notice, and I, at a young age, was sometimes my mum being treated differently than I'd want her to be. But it was at such a young age that I don't know if I really knew how to process what was happening. But it's a powerful thing as a child, isn't it? If you're fortunate to have a close relationship with your parents, not every kid is fortunate to, but if you are, and then you see something not quite fair happening, I suspect those are quite formative experiences in how you turn out to be and what turns out to be what you think matters and what you exist in the world to try and do and think about as well. So I'm not great at this stuff. I'm incredibly British, but as I kind of sense of what are some of the formative experiences, I do think there probably is something around growing up in a family for which public service was an important thing. And then community, and particularly familial community, was an important thing, a sense of duty to your family around you, which for a lot of immigrant communities is a large part. And then a sense of acceptance, but also not everything being totally fair in treatment. And I expect if you add that all up, probably explains part of why I got interested in the things I've got interested.
It appears on your LinkedIn profile that you speak English, German, and Spanish. So far, your family background hasn't explained that. How is it you speak those languages?
Please don't. I may need to update my LinkedIn profile. The German comes from, I spent my first job was in Germany. And so I took some time out between leaving school and starting university. And sometimes people talk about that being a formative experience, particularly if they had the funds to do it, to kind of go backpacking across some beautiful bits of the world. I went to work for an oil and gas firm in Germany. I'm not quite sure what the logic was at the time, there must have been one. That was a great experience. Also partly experiencing what I didn't want to do with my life as well. But it was, really excellent to go get a proper job and experience a world of work. So that was the German bit. And the Spanish bit was, as I left university, I got a job with a consultancy, the Boston Consulting Group. And I was lucky to join the consultancy at the time when they were really keen to get people to join them. And they would go to great lengths to explain what a wonderful place they were to work. They must have been really keen to have people work with them, to hire me. But anyway, they did. And they offered time overseas to study a different language. So I saw that. I thought, that's brilliant. So I said, yes, please. And so I spent the best part of 6 months in Argentina learning Spanish. What I discovered once I'd asked to go was that although this was in the promotional materials, I was the first person to ask whether this thing existed and to try and take advantage of it. And so I think it was in the promotional materials, but the sense was nobody would be idiotic enough before they'd even worked a day at the organisation to say, can you pay me to go learn a language for 6 months? But sadly, I was that. But I had a wonderful time in Argentina as a result.
Did you go to public school?
So I went to my local grammar school, and then upon leaving that via time spent in an oil and gas firm in Germany, I went to university here in the UK, and I went to Cambridge, and I studied this brilliant degree, I think, of social and political sciences, which when I was doing it was I don't know how they quite got away with making this a degree. It was a sort of kind of pick and mix course of interesting things. So you could study social psychology, political science, social anthropology, sociology, and all of the subdisciplines of those. And you would kind of pick and mix the bits that were interesting. And it was great fun to do, but you would kind of end up in these slightly, again, there's going to be a pattern here of kind of choosing things that it turns out nobody else chose to do. But there was one course I did where I thought game theory would be super interesting to study from a political science perspective. So I kind of signed up to that. And I spent a whole year being the only person who had signed up to that. But because it was scheduled by the university, we would have to go to this really big lecture hall where there'd be kind of room for 200 people and just me and the person lecturing would turn up. But it was a great degree, and I see now super helpful for the sorts of things I've gone on to do.
And you went on to get a master's also.
It was one right after the other. So the master's was in international relations, and that was a really fun course. And what was brilliant about it was that the course pulled together people like me, basically, who were interested in the academic study of international relations, and then people who were mid-career in doing interesting things in the world. So diplomats and soldiers and people working in industry. And it was brilliant at still a relatively young age to be having a seminar or having a discussion with you would come out with your theory of how the world was, and then somebody would say, I'm not sure it is exactly like that. And then they would give their experience. But also, I think it was quite interesting for those people who are mid-career just to be in a room with people who are unencumbered by any experience at all, which is actually quite refreshing. And I think it's something that we don't do enough. I think it's something where expertise is important on things, but also just the ability to sit in a room with somebody who knows nothing about the topic but is engaged or is a powerful thing. We need to be able to break out in certain ways of thinking. So it was excellent for that. It also helped me realize that I wasn't going to be a career academic as well. Although I enjoyed aspects of academia, what I realized was that I wanted to be in the doing of things. Now, academics do, but I became clear that I wanted to go out and be very active in the doing of things.
How was it that this was a master's of philosophy? International relations is under philosophy.
Oh, I think that's just Cambridge and Oxford do the same of these bizarre things that they allow themselves to get away with. So it was a master's. It was just a master's.
It sounded so much more profound.
Yeah, well, I think it's a sort of kind of it's the Wizard of Oz, right, behind the curtain. Behind the curtain. So it was a master. I was so lucky to get to do it.
Then you got out of there, I guess we're somewhere around 2004, and then you landed at Boston Consulting Group, but in New York, right?
Yeah. And it was mostly because I thought it's going to be so much fun to be in New York. And it was. New York in your 20s New York is always a fun place, but New York in your 20s is an especially fun place. But it was sort of full on experience because simultaneously there was the kind of the work ethic of Americans, which is high, plus the competitive of your New Yorkers as well, which is even higher. And then there's a city that once you step out of work, you feel, well, what I can't do is go back to bed. I need to go experience this because it's so full of energy. So I had a wonderful time, but the years there kind of felt a little bit like dog years. Like every 1 year of real time was actually 7 years of what your body experienced positively and also just kind of in terms of sleep deprivation as well.
What was the idea of going into strategy consulting when you went there?
Radical candor here. Is I had no idea what I wanted to do. Or that's untrue. I didn't know where to do it. I think I knew through what I wanted to be doing in the world, but it was trying to find a place that I could do that. And so I wasn't quite sure. And then I started speaking to the people at BCG, and it struck me it would be a wonderful place just to learn some stuff, to learn about how organizations operated and how people thought about strategy, which for me was always about how do you get from here to there. Then I was really engaged by the people I met who seemed creative and interesting. And it was a slightly oddball group that I joined with. The person who recruited us all into the organization at the time we were there has left BCG to go become a priest. And people have gone on to all sorts of interesting things. So I don't know how successful it was to the Boston Consulting Group recruiting us because we moved to slightly different things, but it was a wonderful place and group to join with. And it really, I think, there are limitations to the model, absolutely, but it was a great grounding in some structured ways of approaching problems and thinking about the world, and some really helpful tips and tricks of how to be effective in getting things done as well, that has served me incredibly well throughout my career.
When you said you knew what you wanted to do, what was it that you knew you wanted to do?
I knew I wanted to do things that contributed towards making the world a slightly better place for more people. And that again sounds very British and tepid in the way that I described it, right? A slightly better place for more people. But that was it. That was it. And I knew that I was good with concepts and ideas. I like fitting things together, sometimes in ways that haven't been put together before. An element of trying new things. So that's what I kind of wanted to do, but I didn't quite know how to shape that into something that you would do for a job. And I guess in my thinking, I mean, now I've got such a richer view of the way in which you can go and do stuff in the world. But I think at the time I was fairly kind of, and still am quite conventional in thinking that you go to a university and then you get a certain type of job, and that job is like a full-time job, and it's best if it's kind of in a firm that people have heard about, and like all super conventional to it.
So I guess you did that about 4 years or so, and then you landed at 10 Downing Street.
Yeah.
as a senior advisor around 2008. And I guess between 2008 and 2009, 2010, there was plenty of things to be advising on during that period of time. How did that come about?
So it came about because I saw an ad in The Economist for a role working on strategy in Downing Street. I was in New York at the time, so why on earth the UK government was advertising in New York for strategists for roles that I think you had to be British to do? It's beyond me, but perhaps that was part of the challenge of what they did address it. But anyway, it worked very well for me. And I think that perhaps now all the consulting firms have much better social impact practices now than they did then. But the social impact practices weren't great then, or rather it was a very tiny part of what you got to do. And so the way I used to describe it to people was working as a strategy consultant was a great role, but I finished the day at Cited more than I started the day at Cited, which was I couldn't help but be excited at the end of the day by the intellectual questions that had come up, the quality of the people that I was working with and learning from. But the nature of what we were working on, I don't think at my very core, I really felt, that's what I've been put on this planet to do. And so there was this sort of dream opportunity to go be a strategy consultant for the British government and work on a range of big challenges that the country was facing. And you can imagine this kid who'd grown up in a family where there was a sense of public service was what you did. They've then gone to university to study political science, done a master's in international relations, spent time at the Boston Consulting Group. This felt like, oh yeah, perfect. This is the ideal role for me. And it's not every job, but occasionally there are some things that you remember the moment you got a yes for, and how your soul sings at that yes. And my soul does, because everything I do now is, I think, as a result of having had that opportunity. So I joined the government and was pulled over pretty quickly to work closely with Gordon Brown and team on setting up something called the National Economic Council, which was the crisis response body to the global financial crash. And the reason I was pulled across to that was basically there weren't that many people outside of the Treasury at the time who had experience of working in financial services. And when I'd been a consultant in New York, the main area of focus had been on financial services. So that was, as you can imagine, a fascinating experience. It was a fascinating experience in the importance of the government, but the real world in which big policy and political decisions are made, which is incomplete information, acting in real time to things that all you know is that the decision you are making is consequential. But you have such limited view of what will the full effect and consequence and unintended consequence be of these things that we are doing. And so it was at a relatively early stage of my career, just exhilarating, scary, and fascinating, just as to, oh, this is what happens.
But when you got pulled across, was that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office as head of strategic policy, or was that something else?
That was something else. So having done that role, there was a sort of it was this thing that you were never quite sure about. So I did a period of a few years in different departments. I worked in the Foreign Office for a while. I worked in the Department of Business for a while as well. And you're being moved around. And what you're never quite sure about is, are you on some sort of track where you're being given lots of experiences in a relatively short space of time to position you well for ever more senior roles? Or is nobody quite sure what to do with you, and it's being moved around from department to department? And let's leave some ambiguity as to which it was. But I ended up getting a phone call from the Cabinet Office and the phone call basically went, Kieron, there's this team that is being set up around this thing called social investment. You've done stuff in finances. Didn't you do something with the the National Economic Council? Does that sound interesting? And, another super lucky career moment that came up, and somebody thought to give me a phone call about, because that has come to shape the past 15 years of my life, and I suspect the remainder. So what happened then was I moved back from the Department for Business to the Cabinet Office to lead the government's work around social innovation broadly, but specifically growing the field of what we were then calling social impact investing here in the UK. And it was so this was kind of 2012, 13, that sort of time. And in the UK, it was an exciting moment for this space. I mean, there were lots of headwinds. More broadly, the position was one, austerity starting to take hold in UK public services. But there was still space and capacity for government to be doing some really original things. Well, original for government. Right? Let's not overstate it. Because I was in this thing called the Government Innovation Group, which I was never quite sure, is that just an oxymoron writ large? But we had time and space to engage with others on really thoughtful work about how do you grow a market? How do you grow a field by which those who require capital to achieve a greater social impact in the world can be connected to those who want to provide that capital? And particularly from the perspective of a government, what can you do to support it in all of those different roles? And what was always fascinating about the space for me is that it required a three-layered perspective on what government was, because you had, at the one hand, government's role in all of this is that, well, government's one of the biggest purchasers of impact, social impact. Governments are one of the biggest purchasers of it. So you had government as a buyer of impact, and what was the marketplace you needed to have more efficient impact happening in the world. You have governments as have quite a lot of money to seed investments and catalytic capital as well. So you had government as an investor in the space, and then you had government in that sort of kind of classic way of an enabler, setting regulation or law or flying the flag for this new idea, this new way in which people ought to be thinking about the connectivity of finance and impact. So it was a great role because we really just spent time exploring, well, what does a reasonably coherent strategy of action look like in that? And that led to things like the creation of Big Society Capital, the world's first wholesale social investment bank. It led to the creation of things like what, like now is what's known as the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing, but came out of work that we did to put all of this on the G7 radar. It led to the creation of novel financing instruments as well. It was a moment also where, and you have these moments in governments, I've realized, where something has attention, attraction and resources, but is yet to be really politically contested. And if you're an entrepreneurial public servant, you can get an awful lot done in that space.
You went into this posting around 2012, and I think the title was officially Director of Impact Investment. And 2012 was early doors for impact investing. But what was the zeitgeist? How did this percolate up in the mind of the governments to actually say, we need to get a chap like you to do this?
Few things that played through to it. Largely how this was playing out in government at the time, or how it was percolating through, was not where it is now, or not where I think the promise is now. Because I think the promise now is we are talking about an impact economy. We are talking about what ways can and must the economy be shaped for the future, and what methods of thinking do you need for a sustainable, resilient, fair, inclusive economy. So I think that's what we're going to get to in all of this conversation. But at the time, we weren't talking about that. But I mean, broadly, we're talking about public service reform. I would say that there were two strands of focus that seemed most dominant at the time. One was around different ways in which government could interact with society at large to arrive at better social outcomes for more people. There was a growing interest in outcomes-based commissioning. That was a big thing. There was a growing interest in government starting to use its funding in different ways that were more efficient at crowding in different forms of philanthropy or private capital alongside. I mean, none of that was new at the time, but it was only in little pockets, and we were starting to pull it together. And that's often what happens in government. You start to see pockets and say, well, there's something here. The other big push of all of this, particularly in the UK, and in other countries it's different, but in the UK, a lot of the focus was around what was needed for a vibrant but under-resourced social economy and social sector to have access to the capital it needed in order to do what it does so brilliantly. So a lot of the focus was on the financing requirements of what you might call a voluntary community and social enterprise sector. Now, again, I would say that the field of impact investing covers both that and goes broader now. But at the time, those were the bits that we were focusing on. And so you can see that in some of the work that we were doing at the time. So Big Society Capital, when it was set up as a wholesale fund for social investment, the language we were using at the time was around it being set up to invest in social enterprises, or invest in funds that invest in social enterprises. We were paying great attention to what are now called social outcomes partnerships, but at the time we were calling social impact bonds because of this sort of kind of public service reform agenda. And that led to some work, some of which really caught on, some of which sadly still hasn't, but I think is important too. But perhaps we'll get onto that.
You were the key architect of the UK government's strategy to make the UK a global hub for impact investing. So what was the impetus to try to make the UK a global hub for impact? Because that's a much different vision.
A few things that sat behind it. Global in the sense of capital is global. Global in the sense of, candidly, what can get governments interested is a sense that other bits of the world are paying attention. And so there was a sort of kind of play here that this will increase the domestic focus on this, if we can talk about the international relevance of it. And then global in the sense of countries across the world are learning from each other around this, because it's all quite new and some bits of it are clear and some bits of it are very unclear. So how do we participate, network, interact with each other on it? And there was a little bit of it was about kind of trade and investment as well, which was how do we attract finance to this country that could choose to go elsewhere? And the jobs that will create and what that will mean for kind of UK productivity. That was kind of the language that we were using at the time. I think it's still very relevant. When we talk about impact investing, obviously we can talk about the importance of impact investing. We can talk about what impact investments are doing. But we can also reflect on the industry that exists around impact investing and it being an important industry in its own right. And like all industries, there are network effects and scale effects as well. Ideally, you want the lawyers who work on the most complicated and powerful impact investment deals and structures to know each other and learn from each other. And that's some of the work that we do at the moment. That was kind of part of the thinking too.
You brought up Big Society Capitals. I believe that was created around the time that you were director of impact. And to this day, you're on the board of directors there, correct?
Yeah.
What was the genesis behind its creation? And maybe you can just give an overview of Big Society Capital and its mission and so forth.
This was work that was carried out when we launched it. It was under a Conservative government, but the original thinking happened under a Labour government. It was an important thing to say that there was a sort of kind of a cross-party interest in the idea. And two things came to play. So the idea behind Big Society Capital was to help develop out a marketplace, a field of social investment or of impact investing for government to move into the space of creating a wholesaler. So government's previous experiments, and some quite successful experiments, have been in government in directly setting up funds that themselves made investments. But the idea here was create a wholesaler to invest in emergent funds, to encourage the development of new funds. And this was part of how you would build out a marketplace and a more robust marketplace of social investments. When we created it at the time, it was much bigger than the field. So we created it with £600 million This was back in 2012. And some of that money came from investments by some of our main banks. And a lot of that money came from dormant bank accounts. So bank accounts that had been untouched for 10 plus years. A neat way of using those funds for a further social purpose. And so it was set up to be deliberately bigger than the market itself, to, I guess, be a beacon, to have sufficient size to do something, to be able to pull together a talented team, to develop great practices around this. And a big society capital has learned a huge amount over its past 10 years.
Who were the original investors for that?
There were 4 high street banks put in £200 million, and then £400 million came from dormant bank accounts. Through its work, that original £600 million has led to now a social investment marketplace of £10 billion in the UK because of this model of cornerstoning funds, of investing in funds that themselves then invest in a wide range of business models that at their core are about achieving deep social impact in the world. And that's the real space that big society capital is in.
So their impact strategy was to invest in funds. They did not do direct investments. They were investing in funds. Was that primarily startup funds, or are these to help new funds get launched that were focused on impact, or were they pre-existing funds?
It was a range. So there were pre-existing funds at the time, not nearly as many as there are now. The world has changed quite a lot over the past 10 plus years. Some was investing in pre-existing funds, and some was being a place for early funds to go to as well, funds that were being set up to either invest in social enterprises or business models where social impact was deep. But quite a lot of it was also just recognizing that something else was happening in the economy, that it was becoming more and more common for people to set up purpose-led businesses where the economic value went hand in hand with the creation of environmental or social value. And so it was it was part in response to that too. And then obviously when you set up an organization that's a wholesaler of that size, there's a recycling that goes on. So you kind of made the investment, some of the investments were successful, not all of them have been, but sufficient enough that the capital gets recycled for big society capital to make further investments in funds as well. So it's a very efficient way for governments to seed a market. And so what we've seen is that the big society capital idea has been copied around the world in various different formats, which is great to see. And it's been copied, and aspects of it have been improved upon to the point that big society capital can learn from other wholesale funds that have been set up for its own practices now.
How does BSC measure impact for their investments?
A lot of it was pioneering. Sometimes what pioneering means, in my experience, is pulling together other aspects of pioneering practice. It's not totally brand new. The newness of it comes from being in a position to pull different bits of it together. So that's I think, kind of the experience at BSC. Well, I mean, there's been a real journey there for big society capital of how to think about impact. It's got so much more sophisticated over the years. It's always been good. It's just got better. What do I mean by that? So the BSC was one of the early partners in the impact management, the IMP project. It thought about what could it tell across the variety of its funds that it invested in, and how did you kind of aggregate as well across? How did you start thinking beyond just kind of the impact of the funds, but also how you had conversations with management of funds, set up incentive structures that push towards impact? But where I'd say I've been really struck by how our thinking at Big Society Capital evolved was to start being even clearer about what was the systemic impact that we hoped for from the work that we do. What were the market systems in which we were investing? Be it, for example, housing being an obvious one, but energy, community energy, and what was the systemic impact of the sorts of funds that BSC was investing in and the models emerging from the enterprises that those funds were themselves investing in. That is still a work in progress. It's a tricky territory, but it's the right one. It's where really an investor of the scale that Big Society Capital is, provided as it is with public funds or quasi-public funds, ought to be. So there's a lot to, if people are listening and interested, I'd really encourage them to go to the Big Society Capital website. There are some great expositions of how Big Society Capital is thinking about its role of investing in market systems.
You're a director at Big Society Capital now. What is the role of a director at an impact investment business? I guess it must be bigger than just setting investment strategy and deciding what to or what not to invest in.
Yeah, I think what a good question. It is much more, particularly when it's Big Society Capital was set up with a mandate not only to invest, but also to grow the field, to be a market builder for social investment. So that's what we have to do as non-executive directors is help the organization achieve every aspect of its mandate. Quite often that is talking about, well, not just what is the investment strategy and what's the investment approach, but how do we think with coherence about these different things? How do we think about how much resource should go towards which different bit of the mandate? What are the strategic decisions that we ought to be taking for how we might be able to make activities now whose real significance will play out in 5, 10, 15 years' time? And what has really struck me of having been involved in the organisation for a long time is there was a period, I think, where there was a sense that you had people who had kind of impact experience sitting around that board table, or you had people who had finance experience sitting around that board table. Increasingly, you have people sitting around that table for whom that is a false distinction to make. I'd like to say that my career has said that actually it's both, and that is the world that is emerging, I think.
You set up or were involved with the setting up of BSC when you were working in the cabinet office, and Sir Ronald Cohen was quite a big part of that. How influential was Sir Ronald Cohen on your approach to impact or social investment?
Ronnie has been visionary about this space. Ronnie was the driving force behind a lot of the government's engagement in the space through force of vision as much as anything. What I really saw and learned from Ronnie was basically just not taking no for an answer. I mean, it's remarkable how far that can take you. Now, it also helps if you're blessed with all the things that Ronnie's been blessed with. But the last thing I saw was just real kind of consistency and purpose. And so Ronnie has been speaking for the past 40 years about a very simple idea of that in the allocation of capital, we need to think about risk, return, and impact. And he's explored different ways in which that can be articulated. But that's the core idea. And many others are out there as well who also push. But what I've been really struck by is that, this is somebody who's pushed real consistency at that and just hasn't accepted no for an answer. And it is incredible what you can get done. But so Ronnie was really foundational to so much of what has happened here in the UK and in other places too.
Moving on to your next big step in your journey, in your immediate past role, you were the chief executive of Guy's and St. Thomas Foundation for about 7 years.
Yeah.
I expect a lot of my audience, being international, will not necessarily be familiar with Guy's and St. Thomas Foundation. So maybe you could give an overview.
I'll say a little bit about it. So Guy's and St. Thomas's Foundation is about 800 years old and is one of Europe's largest foundations. And what's incredibly cool about it, to my mind, is that historically it has worked in just 2 boroughs of London, Lambeth and Southwark. So that's about, if you were to think of the population of there, about 600,000 people combined. So roughly the size of Detroit. But if you were to pick an area of the world that you said was a mirror to the world's population, it would be those 2 boroughs in London. What you see of those 2 boroughs is an extraordinary range of outcomes, an extraordinary range and diversity of people all around the world. But also, Guy's and St. Thomas's Foundation was a health charity. It had a focus on, the mission was to build a healthier society. And we saw in those 2 boroughs extraordinary differences in health outcomes, inexcusable differences in health outcomes. So streets that were just 12 minutes apart by a bus journey would have a 14-year difference in life expectancy. I mean, that's a difference between seeing your grandkids or not. It's an extraordinary thing. And so what we were doing at Guys of St. Thomas's Foundation was to say, let's use our philanthropy to build a healthier society, and let's really get into some of those questions of health inequality and find out ways that you can actually do something very practical about it.
And it's actually connected with a hospital, right?
Yeah. So the history of all the hospitals, older hospitals in the UK, is that they were originally charities. And in the 1940s in the UK, the hospitals became nationalised. The state started to provide healthcare, and that was the formation in the UK of our national health system. But what happened about those charitable funds that had originally been supporting the hospitals? And so those charitable funds became endured, and over time became things like charitable foundations, of which I went to run the Guys of St. Thomas's one. And so we set this question for ourselves of how both do we support the hospitals, Guys of St. Thomas's hospitals. Guys of St. Thomas's is the UK's largest hospital trust. How do we support the hospital directly, but also indirectly in how do you keep people healthy in the first place? So they don't need to use a hospital, because that's the way that you can help a hospital most, is reduce the need for people to go there.
The reason why we're speaking about this, and this is relevant for the audience, is that when you're there, you're managing a fairly large endowment, and a certain percentage of that endowment is devoted to impact. Maybe you can talk about how much is the AUM of the endowment and what percent isn't devoted to impact, and the theory of change that you had for that.
I'll tell a story of how we got there. So the endowment's about £1 billion in size, a little over. But let me tell the story of what was happening as we were tackling this question of how do you keep people healthy for longer. And this will get back to impact investing, but I think it's important to start here. So keeping people healthy for longer is really working out, well, what drives our health? And what drives our health is three things. One, it's our individual genetics, just how we're born. The second are the choices that we make in life. What behaviors do we have? The third is the conditions that we live and grow up and work in. And that is by far the largest thing that impacts our health overall. Anything to 70 to 80% of our health is determined by that. So if we're talking about the places that we live, our house, or the food that we eat, buy from shops and supermarkets, or the air that we breathe, which can happen from both how buildings are built or the cars driving past us, all of those things are shaped by commercial dynamics. And so as you start getting into the question of how do you create health, you start getting into the space of in what ways do businesses and then investors who invest in those businesses, in what way do they affect health? And in what ways can they promote health? And you can say that this is a good thing to do, but it's a morally good thing to do. But actually you can make an even more, in my mind, an even more persuasive argument, which is that actually it's in everybody's interest, in every investor's interest, in every business's interest to have a healthy society. That's just good for business. It's good for investing in. So the reason I say all of that is we're doing lots of work through the grant-making bit of the foundation on really novel experiments around how do you shape the commercial environments around people. We ran the world's biggest ever experiment around behavioural nudges in supermarkets across 200 stores in London, of swapping out really unhealthy food for slightly less unhealthier food, for putting buy one, get one free on the carrots instead of the fizzy drinks, that sort of thing, and working out what could you change in the commercial environment by looking at the till receipts to see were people buying healthier baskets of food and what was the impact on store profitability. Turns out you could do a load of stuff that both made the stores the same amount of money or more money and was also healthier for their customers. And so these stores didn't just do it there. These supermarket chains just rolled this stuff out quietly across the whole of the UK. So we're doing really interesting work there. But this question that really came to me, and many others are asking, but perhaps we were amongst the earlier to be asking, was, well, why are we only thinking about this with 4% of our assets, the 4% that we grant out each year? What is the other 96% doing? And 96% is a much bigger number than 4. More than that, are we investing in things as an endowment that are actively working against those things that we're granting money out for? And why are we assuming that it's more effective for us to give money away rather than invest money to have an impact? And why are we assuming that every problem that we're trying to tackle is grant-shaped? Perhaps some are not grant-shaped, but that's the sort of space that we got into. Long story short, we became very focused on the question of how do we use all of our assets in support of our mission, not just the 4% that we grant out, but the 96% that were invested. So we then developed a strategy for thinking through that. And so we were the first major foundation in Europe to set a dual mandate to our endowment. And that dual mandate said we needed both sustainable financial returns, but health impact. And then we thought about that health impact or the achievement of that dual mandate in various ways. So we set within the main endowment a certain allocation towards investments that we were testing. We can get into kind of that impact investing allocation. We owned a lot of property, and we're quite an active property developer through our endowment. We got deeply focused on the questions of, as a property developer, how do you develop property that promotes health in a way that's commercially scalable? Because unless it's commercially scalable, the health impact won't scale alongside it. Through to, we got deeply engaged, and perhaps we can come back to this, with questions of how, as a steward, owner of companies, can we use our stewardship voice to promote health and sustainability and economic sustainability at the same time? So a coherent strategy of how do you achieve that dual mandate. The impact allocation is a bit that people get often quite interested in, although all of it, I would say, is a combined strategy and needs to be done together. But the impact allocation started off around 30, 40 million pounds. We grew it to 100 million pounds. And the intent was to learn through it in a direction that would get it to be the full £1 billion of endowment. And what was it invested in? It was a range. It was invested in those things that we knew through our grant-making work impacted people's health. So that was a combination both of investing in medical technologies and the life sciences and healthcare services. But back to that story of what's the 80% of stuff that impacts our health? It's housing, so we invested in housing. It's nutrition, so we invested in nutrition. And so these things are sometimes called the wider determinants, the social or commercial determinants of health. So we invested in this broader space. And we had a bit of a learning journey on it as well. We started off broadly by saying, well, let's just get going. This can all feel quite complex if you try and arrive at it purely philosophically. So let's just try and make some investments. And some of our early investments were in some great funds. For example, funds focused on housing for women and children at risk, and a model where high quality, safe and secure housing is provided for women and children. What pays back that revenue model is essentially government housing support. Now, if you kind of step back a bit, that basically is a government bond. I mean, governments are providing housing support for donkey's years and are likely to for donkey's years too. So it actually looked like very similar to other things that we were invested in if you just kind of looked at it in the right sort of way. But it had a profound impact on people's health. But what we started to find was that we were aiming for win-win investments, by which we said we were aiming for things where the financial returns looked kind of consistent with other things that we're investing in, and the impact was high. Where we got to over time was we started to say, well, that's great, that's a great place to start, but we should really be thinking about this at the level of the portfolio, not the individual investment. Because you can have a diversified portfolio, you ought to be able to do more interesting things with it. And what that pushed towards was more of a barbell strategy, where we started to say, okay, where are the investments that have a deep and profound health impact and that can offer us capital preservation or capital preservation plus. And then to balance that, where are there high-performing, responsible investments that, and when I say high-performing in terms of their financial performance, and how do we optimize which one of those has the biggest health impact? So it became a barbell strategy where we're saying, well, actually at the portfolio level, how are we optimizing for both health impact and for financial returns as a whole, which I think at the level of an endowment is an important one to do. And it allowed us a much richer diversity of funds that we could invest in as a result. And I would say a much bigger impact upon the world and much more learning, which are fundamentally is what this is about.
When you're discussing investing in housing for disadvantaged women or battered women, are you doing direct investments or are you direct investing in funds like Ben Rick's Social and Sustainable Capital or something like that?
Resonance was the fund that I had to, always very careful to talk with equal care and love about these wonderful funds that are out there rather than promote one in particular. But we were investing in funds through our endowment. There were a couple of reasons for that. One was that's what we were set up to do. Not saying it's right, but that's kind of the experience we had as an investment committee as an investor, was investing in funds and how we were just kind of configured in terms of like the number of people we had and what they knew how to do. The second was that we, through our grant-making activities, we were doing direct investments. But this was one of the interesting aspects. So through our grant-making activities, sometimes it was giving money away. Sometimes it was flexible funding, sometimes it was a loan that turned into a grant if it needed to, and all forms of flexible finance. Where we never quite got to was I was there, but I wouldn't be surprised if endowments do over time, is be able to close the gap that exists between those two different things. So what we were finding is that as we were making direct investments through our grant-making activity, that would get to a certain size of direct investment that we're able to do. And that when we're investing in funds, that got to a certain size of fund that we're able to invest in. You'd like to imagine that kind of covers every single capital requirement. Where we were, there was still a gap that we were not covering. And there are endowments out there thinking quite hard about how they're able to address that gap.
So you've made the case of how you started to think about applying capital to solve social problems and health outcomes. What can applying capital not do for social problems and health outcomes?
The easy answer is to say there are some things out there that are just bad for health. So tobacco, for example, tobacco in any form is a bad thing for health. Where I've spent more time focused is on what things can you invest in that could be even better for health than they are at the moment. That's an area I'm really interested in, and it's a vital area for us. The one I spent particular time on is nutrition. And so let me kind of come at this from a different angle, which is that in the UK, our great economic challenge we have as a country is that we have 2.8 million people who are too unwell to work. The largest single factor behind that fact is ill health caused by diet. There are other contributing factors. Mental health is a major issue. But ill health caused by diet, the food environments around people, and what that means for people's health, is playing out in incredibly high levels of obesity in the UK, in the US, and across the world. And this is a huge economic challenge. So quite apart from it being a health challenge, this is an economic challenge. This is a productivity challenge. So what we need to be able to do is identify those business models, those business practices that create diets and create food environments for people where the affordable, the accessible food is also better for people. And that will improve people's health, but it'll also help with those grand economic challenges that we have from issues like food-related ill health. And so what can you invest in there? Well, one of the things that we set up when I was at Guy's and St. Thomas's Foundation was a fund investing in startups that are promoting healthier food that was at a price point that worked for a mass market. That's a great thing to invest in. Now, What happens is some of those startups are successful, a lot aren't. It's an incredibly competitive business, competitive industry to be in. But the main effect of change is that your big brands and your big manufacturers and retailers see these startups and say, well, that's great. We're going to purchase you, or we might copy what you do. That's less good, but anyway. But in some way, it is good because new food techniques, new food stuff start to come into the food environment at a price point that works for people who are tight on time and money, and so it becomes part of our national diet. So that's a great thing to invest in. The allocation of capital is both kind of new capital being allocated, but it's also what do you do with capital that has already been allocated? What do you do as the owner, particularly an investor? What do you do as the owner of companies? And I helped found and chair now an alliance of institutional investors. The alliance is called Long-Term Investors in People's Health, or LIFE, LIPH. So the spelling's a bit dodgy, but LIFE. And we have about 7 trillion of assets in this alliance. And we are focused as institutional investors on how do we help companies evolve their practices to do things that are good for population health. And the reason we want them to do it is because it's good for business. It's good for investing. And so the sort of thing that we've been able to do there is, as an alliance, we've been able to work with companies like Unilever and Danone globally to improve the healthiness of the products that they sell. And there's a very direct analogy we can draw to climate here. So lots of institutional investors have engaged deeply around oil and gas and said, look, it's a stranded asset, or certain aspects of it, a stranded asset. It's losing value. We as a long-term investor would like the companies that we're working in to work out how they're going to mitigate the risk of being involved in stranded assets. Well, there are more sugar taxes globally than there are carbon taxes. And so that's why institutional investors are getting focused on food. So it's a long-winded answer, but effectively to say that these are the sorts of ways in which investors can engage around things that promote opportunities to change practices to arrive at better health as a great thing in and of itself, because what is more important to any of us than our health, but also because this has a profound economic and societal purpose.
When you're making your investment decisions, you had to set objectives for investment risk and investment return and impact objectives. Was that iterative? How did you balance those three?
Hugely iterative. So it's back to this point where I said, kind of, what is pioneering practice? In my experience, is standing on the shoulders of other people's efforts and discoveries. So a lot of the work that we did just built upon what had come from others around us. But yes, we did exactly that. We did a lot of work thinking about, well, what drives health? And when we think about health, how do we understand where we want that health to occur and for whom? And with what intensity? We had to think quite hard about, well, what levels of risk were we willing to have in this allocation? We did a lot of work to say, how do we right-size a portfolio as a carve-in of our endowment that we can carry a higher degree of risk in order to be able to learn about how to invest in this sort of way while still meeting the overall returns expectations that the endowment had over a long-term period. There was deep and sophisticated work behind this. We'll get to the work I do at the Impact Investing Institute in a bit, I'm sure. But we now do a lot of work at the Institute showcasing how endowments are thinking about this question. We've got a number of reports to share of how endowments are thinking about setting these criteria, setting the portfolio, thinking about the tactical allocation, right the way through to what's their investment policy statement is as well. Because it's all of these kind of very granular things that you need to do.
I know you're no longer there, but a recent report that I pulled was around March 2023. It seems like the majority of the impact investments were in direct property. I don't know if that was similar when you were there, so it's about 80% of the portfolio. Why is direct property a majority of impact? And was it like that when you were there or not?
A couple of things going on there. One is, property, if you're thinking about health, property is a powerful way of improving the environments in which people live. So it's a great vector for health improvements and also in ways in which capital could play a really material role. But also specifically for us was part of the history of where our endowment was. And one of the things that we did at whilst I was there was deliberately overinvest in property in adjacent spaces in London to create the opportunity to develop what is going to be one of London's largest life sciences developments. And so that's kind of a particular reason. The reason that we wanted to do that is right back to where I started on what is attractive about the foundation is that the area it works in looks like the world. It's as diverse as the world is. And that means that the life sciences work that's done there is relevant to the world. And that's why we were very keen, and that's how we were thinking about the impact of the work that we were doing. Another way, let me give a negative answer to that. I don't think that to be an endowment investing in impact, it can only be a property play. That was specific for us and how we were formed.
I found in my research that you led and created a number of innovative impact alliances during your time there to reduce health inequalities or inequities in the UK. Can you speak to one or two of those examples?
We've already spoken about the work of long-term investors in people's health. That was one alliance that has been incredibly powerful. The alliances that, you're speaking to a global audience here, but the alliances that I think are some of the most powerful ones, though, were ones that nobody will ever hear of. They were local ones of organisations in that bit of South London doing profoundly important work for the health of communities, particularly in areas often of lower income, often with underrepresented groups in political voice. And those were some of the most powerful alliances that we engaged with in all sorts of ways. Let me give a particular story, and I know that we're getting tight on time, so I'll try and be brief, but I think this one is important to me. So one of the things that happened, the pandemic hit, was we as an organisation that worked intensely in place and did a lot of test and learn projects, a lot of research projects, a lot of anthropological work, came to realise that what we were doing was we were often asking people to go to areas and observe and learn and listen and study. We can't do that when a society is locked down. So we worked instead with people who lived in the area, citizens, and asked them what's happening. Okay? And there were some tools that they were facilitated with to help get the observations. Also, we could use them from a research perspective. But there was all sorts of cultural understanding that we just lacked before that started to come through. Why was that important? Well, the reason it was most important is that we saw very early on through what we were learning from community researchers that there was deep distrust in the vaccine to COVID-19 from particular ethnic groups. It was very clear to us before it started to emerge in the data to government. The thing that also became very clear was that the government's messaging at the time, and I was advising on this sort of stuff because we were running big health, was saying protect the NHS, save lives. That was it. Now the challenge is that works well if you trust the NHS, and in the UK the NHS is our most trusted brand, except when it's not, and in a lot of communities it's not. And why might that be? Well, let's take the Black community, where levels of maternal death during birth are 10 times higher for the Black community than for any other community in the UK. And it's similar in other advanced economies too. Profound question, why would you trust a health system that serves, for whatever reason, seems to be serving your mothers so poorly? So we started to get these insights that we were then able to share with the messaging that was being put out around the vaccine, which was less about protect this thing that you might not have trust for to save lives, and much other messaging that was better positioned, more relevant, spoke to the community. And that work will have had a profound impact on saving many, many people's lives. But that's an alliance that nobody will ever hear about, of local actors doing wonderful things that had an impact not just in London, but across the UK as well.
I think during your time at the foundation and around 2020, you did a parallel stint as chief executive at Impact on Urban Health.
Yeah. So Impact on Urban Health was something that we set up at Guy's and St. Thomas's Foundation. It essentially became the arm for our venture philanthropic work. So the grant making, quite a lot of the grant making activity that was focused on making cities healthier places for everyone.
What were you actually doing with that?
So there we were working on issues around food-related ill health and air pollution and multiple long-term conditions. And we were looking at real-world experiments to find ways that you can reshape environments to make them healthier places. So give a practical example. We ran, you might have heard of the concept of social prescribing. Social prescribing is you go see a doctor and the doctor says, instead of giving you a medication, they say, we're going to prescribe you a dance class, because actually physical connection and combating loneliness is an incredibly powerful health intervention. We ran the UK's first pilot of a social intervention social prescribing focus on debt advice. So you go to see your general practitioner will know an awful lot of things about you and might be best placed to say, well, financial insecurity and illness go hand in hand. If you lose your job, it's hard to keep your health. If you don't have great health, it's hard to keep a job. So these things kind of go hand in hand. So what the social prescribing scheme was doing was people would go see a GP, and the GP would say, well, let me put you in contact. Let me put you in contact with somebody who can talk to you about your finances and see if they can help you get access to all of the benefits or things that the state has offered to you. And profoundly impactful. On average, the people who went on this scheme received £2,000 more each year in terms of benefits that the state gives to people that they were owed. And these are some of the people on the lowest incomes in the UK. But their health improved as well. So that's what we were doing. We were doing these kind of real world experiments to say, like, how do you just do stuff that keeps people healthy?
Kieron, I know I made you carry a lot of water to get to what you're actually doing right now, which is probably the whole reason you came on here to speak about today. But a little over a year ago, you moved to your current role as chief executive of the Impact Investing Institute. So tell me, how did that move come about and what attracted you to make that move to this particular organization?
Because it's a wonderful organization. I had a fantastic time at Guy's and St. Thomas's Foundation. I was attracted to the opportunity that we have here at the Impact Investing Institute. And that opportunity is let me tell you a little bit about the Institute. So the Institute was set up by the UK government, and it was set up as a non-profit, an independent non-profit, with a mission to catalyse the field of impact investing at large. And what was fascinating about it, and what is fascinating about our work, is that we act as a bridge between the mainstream of financial markets and new economic ideas. So we, as an organisation, we connect the world's largest asset allocators and asset owners with government actors, with foundations, with civic society actors, and really explore this space of what does it take to transform capital markets in support of an economy that's fairer, that's greener, and that's more resilient. So what I was really attracted to by this opportunity is, how do I take what I learned at Guy's and St. Thomas's Foundation, both through our endowment, but the real world work that we were doing through our philanthropic activity? How do I take what I learned in government around the early architecture of a marketplace to say, well, how do we involve the trillions that exist in capital markets in support of this? And I would say that at my very core, I believe that there is a convergence happening. I believe that there is a convergence happening between those of us who have spent careers focused, and I'm relatively new to this space compared to lots, careers focused on thinking about different, impactful and innovative ways to address society and the planet's greatest problems. often through business approaches, and a convergence with those who are responsible for owning or allocating vast pools of capital, particularly over the long term, and their sense of what do they need to be considering for that capital to be successful over the long term. And that's what the Impact Investing Institute sits right at the nexus of, is how do you amplify that convergence? And in fact, all sounds very coded. For the asset owners or the asset allocators, fundamentally, we have come to an understanding, and we need to scale this understanding of what it takes to have a successful economy. And it is one where we're more attentive to environmental outcomes, social outcomes, community outcomes. As I say, not necessarily because these are the right thing to do, but I think they are right, but people's values vary. But purely through the logic of capital markets, that if we want money to exist now and then money to exist in the future, we need to be thinking much greater coherence about the world in which that money is being invested.
Impact investors who are seeking to make social impact, they have to have a theory of change for achieving this. In your case, you're not actually investing in direct outcomes, but you must have a theory of change for you to expand the impact space. I'd like to understand your theory of change for your investment of your time and your resources in the III.
What a great question. So everything starts with a vision, doesn't it? And so our vision is of transformed capital markets. And capital markets, as I say, are supporting a fairer, greener, more resilient economy. What we see is that impact investing is a powerful tool for driving that transformation, because impact investing focuses on the intentionality and measurability in the management of impact. So there's something real that is happening in that transformation. But also it works within the logic of capital markets. So you can see how they can move relatively quickly to bring an impact lens, these tools of impact investing, to capital allocation. We then, in our work, think about our mission, therefore, being of accelerating impact investing, both in the UK and globally, because we work with some of the world's largest capital owners and capital allocators. That, for us, then, has a focus on how do we embed practice, how do we extend it to new places, and how do we experiment and what's needed to really transform capital markets into the future. And then broadly, our work plays out in two different spaces. One is that we run a challenge lab. We look at how do we advance fresh solutions to real-world problems by connecting institutional impact capital to opportunities for impact. And we do that in all sorts of spaces that I could cover with you. And then we focus on field building. How do we increase understanding, engagement, expertise in around the application of impact approaches? What does that all mean for us when you add it up? Is that we've got three things that we measure ourselves by. One is the amount of capital moved for impact. The second is how effective is the impact capital being? How much more effective impact capital is moving? And then finally, that capital is moving where it's needed as well, which is really the focus of our challenge lab. How do you constantly push the edge of how we understand how impact capital and institutional capital can affect more positive environmental and social outcomes? So that's our theory of change.
I've spoken to a few people informally that I know, and some said that they feel that the Institute preaches more to the already converted, spreading the message of impact investing to impact investors, producing lots of research and reports. The question is, how much is it influencing outcomes? So what do you say to people who have that feeling?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree. A number of reasons. I mean, how does a field grow? It grows out, is the first thing to say. So the converted, everybody needs to become the converted, right? Our work practically is about how do we bring people into this space. So, for example, we do a lot of work with endowments and family offices about what will it practically take to engage in this space. We focus particularly on how do you do it, not why you should do it, partly because some of the why has been won, partly because an efficient use of space is to get those people who are here or close to over the line into doing. And then we do a lot of work to understand how do you get those who are not yet seeing themselves in this space to see themselves in this space. We're running a 2-year program focused on narratives around investment, not narratives around impact investing, but narratives around investment. What is it that investors see the function, particularly institutional investors, see the function of investing to be? What world are they investing for? What is the purpose of their role? And what opportunities does that create for the narratives of impact investing? Or what opportunities does it close out as well? So I'm not sure I would agree with that perspective, but what I would agree with is if the spirit behind it is we need to not be in an echo chamber, we need to make sure that those not yet in this space are in this space. I couldn't agree more. Indeed, I would say that's the very mission of this organization.
What are your plans? I know you're relatively new in the post. What are your strategic goals? Where you plan to take the Institute from here?
The strategic goals, back to that embed, extend, and experiment, because that's what we really need to do. We need to, there is great practice out there. We need to embed it so that it lasts. And, some of this is increasingly contested. So we need to embed it. We need to extend where we've learned how to do something in one place to others. Let me give a very practical example. A lot of the work that some pioneering charitable endowments have done is deeply relevant to the work of family offices. To extend ideas to kind of adjacent spaces. There's 10 trillion that sits in family offices globally. That's an awful lot of money. And then we need to experiment. We don't yet know how to do everything that we need to be able to do. We don't know all the answers. Not us, clearly we don't, but actually investors, society doesn't yet know all the answers. So we need to spend time finding out how do we align environmental, social, and community outcomes with commercial impact? How do we crowd capital into places that have been underinvested for a long time? How do we accelerate a truly globally just transition? And so on and so on and so on. And so our work focuses around those sorts of questions. The aspiration of our next 5 years is that we and others that we work with should be bringing £1 trillion more of impact capital into this space. And that's a goal worth going for.
Is that how you're going to measure it?
Honestly, Scott, there's loads of things that an organization like ours needs to measure and does measure. If I were to say that there's a yardstick that's useful to measure ourselves by, it's that. But it's also about the effectiveness of that impact capital and where is it going. There are lots of things to measure. But the quantum, particularly for an organization like ours, that is facing into some of the world's largest capital markets players, that's an important element.
I think you said some of this is contested. Were you referring to the pushback on ESG?
Yeah, there's definitely that. But it's not as if we won the whole world over yet to the idea that all investment has an impact, that investors need to be thinking both about the short term and the long term, that ultimately those investment strategies that work within planetary boundaries are going to be the successful ones over longer term. All of these areas are still contested.
I guess I didn't realize that there's direct pushback on impact, because I feel impact has a different dimension to it than ESG does. ESG is something different.
Impact isn't ESG. But this idea that we've all got a role to play, government, businesses, investors, in shaping a successful society is such a simple idea, but its articulation and its real manifestation, I should say, still needs a lot of work. And I guess that's why that for me has kind of, I think, been kind of the theme of my career, is how from all of these different spaces can we push broadly towards the same idea that frequently better things that work better for more people tend to be in everyone's interests.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple points, but one is this very thing you said about all investments have impact. It's just, is it a positive one or is it a negative one? No investment has zero impact. And I think to the extent we can get people thinking in terms of thinking beyond financial return, then I think it would be much more natural process. I see the pushback on ESG is because it's much more in America than in Europe, but my feeling is that people are feeling that they're getting ESG shoved down their throat. And so when I see the pushback, I feel like we in the business haven't done our job to demonstrate that this is a better way of investing. In fact, that's the whole purpose of this podcast, is to bring people on. I'm not endorsing necessarily everyone on. I'm letting people explain what they're doing, and you can be the judge. Does it make sense? Does it make more logical sense than investing in the so-called traditional sense?
And perhaps that's a great place to finish off. The bits that I would point those who are still curious about this space towards is to think about what are going to be the successful businesses of this century. And it's going to be those businesses that people want to work for, that people want to buy from. It's going to be those businesses that have seen explicit ways of being part of a net zero transition and living within the planetary boundaries that governments are increasingly regulating about. Impact investors are the people with the front row seat to that opportunity. Impact investors are the ones who are thinking hard about systematic risks that we need to be avoiding if any investor is going to be successful over the coming decades. For those reasons alone, take away the word impact and just think about what are going to be the successful businesses as we think about the decades to come. And just observe those and invest in those. And the own journey that I've been on is that you start to see a great overlay with those that impact funds are focused on.
Kieron, I got a few short answer rapid fire questions, and just give me the first thing that comes to your mind. And if nothing comes to your mind, feel free to take a pass. So if you had to name the one most important challenge in the impact investing space at this time, what would it be and why?
Balancing short versus long term. And I would say that's in the investing space overall.
And what do you know now about impact investing that you wish you knew back in 2012 when you started at the Cabinet Office?
This isn't about one particular aspect of investing or one particular aspect of social or environmental progress. This is fundamentally about what society, what economy, what capital system do we need to have as a species.
Can you describe an example of an investment that you were convinced ticked all your impact boxes, but in the end, it didn't turn out? And what did you learn from that experience?
Yes, I can. And what I learned from it is that we should think that governments would be some of the most secure partners that you could be alongside, but actually often they're the least consistent partners. So it's a call for government stability of when engaging in things.
Now, the converse of that, can you describe an investment that you were skeptical of at the time you invested, or maybe you ultimately passed on it, and in the end, it turned out to be way better than you thought, and you were pleased you invested, or if you had passed on it, you wish you hadn't, and what did you learn from that experience?
Yes, one that we invested in, it led me to a deeper understanding of how digital approaches can scale very, very quickly for great impact. There's a lot to be cautious about in technologies, but there's a lot to be said for scale and impact.
And if someone wants to get into impact investing, how would you advise them to get into the business?
I would say spend a bit of time looking at the impact investing website. Go spend some time looking at the GIN website as well. There's some great resources on there. If you're in the UK, there are networks you can go to that are set up. For example, Big Society Capital runs one, just welcoming people to the impact investing space and saying what's involved within it. perhaps just kind of take stock of where you're sitting at the moment. And one profound question we should always ask ourselves is, rather than go somewhere new, with where we are at the moment, what can we do? So if you're working somewhere, can you make your place an impact investor?
Kieron, I think we made it to the finish line with my questions. I don't know, is there anything we skipped over that you wanted to point out or wanted to say? Because you have a very full history, and so I had to be a little bit selective.
I hope that was helpful. It was great chatting through those areas, and thank you for the opportunity.
Right. I really appreciate it. And these are great stories that you have to tell. And now maybe tell everyone your websites and social, and I think you have a blog.
You can find us at www.impactinvest.org.uk. You can find me on LinkedIn.
All right. And what's the best way for people to contact you?
Best way for people to contact is through LinkedIn, or if you go to our website, there's a way of getting in touch with me there.
All right. Well, Kieron, thanks again.
My pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.